We're burning, Brannock. Do something. Callum Brannock's boots thudded against the grated flooring as he dashed toward the maintenance console, every alarm in Dredger Station 12 shrieking in protest. He skidded to a stop, fingers slamming across the input keys on the laser plasma diagnostic display. The status read exactly what he feared: coolant system rupture. Left unchecked, the entire station would turn into a funeral pyre. Shut off the primary ducts and reroute the overflow to the tertiary loop, he barked, wiping sweat from his brow as heat radiated from the vents above. You think I didn't try? The regulators are fried. Coolant's boiling, shouted Martez, his assistant, arms streaked with grease and sheer panic. Callum exhaled sharply, eyes darting to the exposed maintenance panel at his feet. A single glance told him the truth. The flow valves had melted into twisted slag. The corporation had cut corners on repairs again. A station running on bones and spit, and now it was falling apart in real time. He gritted his teeth, ripping open a nearby access compartment and pulling out an old-fashioned manual override lever, a relic from when ships were built to last. He jammed it down with his full weight, metal grinding, resisting. The gears screeched in protest, then locked. With a deep mechanical groan, the coolant redirection took hold. Pressure equalized. The fires sputtered out. The station shuddered as its dying heartbeat steadied. For now. Martez let out a breathless laugh, hands bracing against his knees. I swear, Brannock, if you weren't here, we'd be vapor by now. Callum exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Wouldn't be the first time the suits up top almost got us killed. A voice cut through the static of the station's intercom, the kind of voice that oozed corporate disinterest, like a man reading out expiration dates on a product no one cared about. Attention! Unauthorized manual intervention detected in System Block 4-7B. Engineer Brannock, report to Supervisor Uxor's office immediately. Callum exchanged a look with Martez. Unbelievable! You just saved the station and they're going to write you up? Callum shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. Supervisor Drell Uxor occupied his office the way a carrion bird sat on a carcass, comfortably, opportunistically. His suit was pressed so stiff it could cut glass, and his expression matched. Callum didn't bother sitting. You rang? Uxor barely glanced up from his heads-up display, fingers lazily scrolling through some corporate directive that had nothing to do with the station's survival. You violated protocol, he said, tone flat. Direct interference in coolant redirection without proper authorization. Station was about to incinerate itself. And yet, Uxor drawled, finally looking up, his expression void of gratitude, you failed to request approval before overriding the system. That's a liability, Brannock. Callum bit down on the urge to slam his fist against the glass desk. Men like Uxor didn't listen to reason. They listened to profit margins. You want a station left standing? Or a debris field floating in the void? Uxor sighed as if dealing with an unruly child. This is exactly why you'll never go anywhere in this company, Brannock. You refuse to understand the chain of command. Before Callum could retort, the station's outer sensors pinged with a proximity alert. Out on the repair deck, a ship came screaming out of sublight travel, dragging sparks across its plating like battle scars unwilling to fade. It was small, a Scout-class interceptor, Nexari in design, but its hull integrity was hanging by a thread. Its stabilizers failed the moment it hit atmosphere, and it spiraled, flames licking its underbelly, metal wailing as it slammed into the landing pad. The emergency sirens erupted. Callum was already moving before the first responder team scrambled. The ship belched steam as it hissed against the coolant foam spread across the deck. The hull was scorched, riddled with impact fractures, and the stabilizer fins were barely holding on by their support struts. A small, flickering heads-up display by the hatch struggled to stay online, the alien script barely legible. Callum didn't need a translator to understand one thing. Atmospheric seals failing. Pilot oxygen levels critical. He didn't wait for authorization, didn't ask for permission. He just moved. The hatch barely budged under his grip. The emergency release jammed. Callum pried it open with a hydraulic crowbar, the internal pressure popping the seal with a rush of stale air. Inside the cramped cockpit, the pilot lay slumped over the controls, unconscious but breathing. Nexari. Juvenile. Callum's gut twisted. Just a kid. "Hey," he murmured, shaking the alien lightly. No response. Their skin, smooth but heat-flecked with bioluminescent patches, felt fevered. The ship's systems were failing, and they were going down with it. "Stay with me, kid." Callum scooped them up, ignoring the dull ache in his shoulder as he carried them out into the hangar. Martez rushed forward. "Damn, that's Nexari, yeah," Callum finished. "Get medical here now." The Nexari pilot stirred, eyes fluttering open, deep-set pupils, ringed with shifting, iridescent bands. Their gaze locked onto Callum, and their mandibles clicked weakly. A single whisper rasped past their lips in a language Callum barely understood. "It's coming." Then they went limp. A shiver crawled down Callum's spine. What the hell did that mean? It took an hour for Uxer to come storming into the hangar, looking like someone had personally offended his bottom line. "You had no authorization to open that ship, Brannock." Callum turned, barely keeping his patience. "The pilot would be dead if I didn't." Uxor sneered. "And if that ship carries biocontaminants? Or political entanglements? Did you consider that?" "The only thing I considered was keeping them alive." Uxor crossed his arms. "You're done here, Brannock." Callum blinked. "What?" "You're fired." For a moment the hangar felt too still, too silent, like the vacuum beyond had stolen the sound. Callum let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am." Uxor's smile was a razor-thin thing. "Clear out your things. You're off this station by morning." Callum's jaw tightened. He looked at the kid, still unconscious on the med stretcher. There was something bigger happening here, and he had just stepped into the middle of it. The kid's breath was shallow, their chest barely rising beneath the thin survival wrap. The med station's sterile lights did little to mask the faint luminescent etching across their skin, shifting in dull waves as if their very biology pulsed with residual energy. Whatever species-wide resilience the Nexari were rumored to have, it wasn't working fast enough. Callum Brannock leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. His own situation wasn't much better. Fired. Just like that. Tossed out like scrap metal the second he made a decision that didn't have a corporate signature on it. Martez was the only one who had the guts to speak. "I could talk to Uxor," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "maybe get them to reconsider." Callum let out a short exhale, something between disbelief and amusement. "And say what?" "Hey, sir, I know you hate him, but maybe let him stick around for another week so you can find a more bureaucratic way to screw him over." Martez scowled. "Look, man, I don't think this is right either, but what's your plan? Gonna drift off to some backwater junk station and fix civilian shuttles for the rest of your days?" Callum didn't answer, because he didn't know. The station lights flickered. For a moment, a low tremor pulsed through the walls, something deep, something old, vibrating through the steel and into his bones. Martez frowned. "You feel that?" Callum straightened, pushing off the doorframe. He stepped toward the nearest heads-up display, tapping through the diagnostics. The station's external readings flickered, staticky interference distorting the feed. Then the first proximity alarm triggered. A distant boom resonated through the station, followed by a dull metallic reverberation, as if the structure itself had taken a breath and let it out in one shuddering exhale. The station-wide intercom crackled to life. "Unidentified fleet detected at approach vector. Class, Nexari Dominion. Multiple capital ships in formation." Nexari. Callum turned sharply toward the med station's only occupied stretcher. The kid was still unconscious, unaware of the firestorm descending toward them. Martez muttered a curse. Why the hell would an entire fleet be here? Callum didn't respond. His gut already knew the answer. Another alert. This time, the station's external defense grid surged online, targeting systems locking onto the approaching warships, alarms cycling into high-alert escalation tones. Then the main display flickered to show what lurked outside. The Nexari Dominion fleet had arrived. And they weren't alone. The bridge of Dredger Station 12 was in pandemonium. Officers swarmed across the control deck, fingers scrambling over interface panels, sweat beading down temples. Supervisor Drell Uxer stood at the forefront, arms rigid behind his back, staring at the primary laser plasma projection of the fleet outside. Warships, dozens of them. And at their center, flanked by colossal battleships lined with heat-scored hull plating, was a dreadnought that could level the entire sector if given cause. "Repeat that last transmission," Uxor ordered, voice struggling for composure. The station's communications officer, Lieutenant Reeves, barely kept her voice steady as she relayed the incoming demand. "High Admiral Kazor Izarin of the Nexari Dominion requests immediate compliance. The Dominion demands the human mechanic responsible for repairing the Nexari scout vessel be brought forward at once." The bridge went silent. Uxor turned, his features an unreadable slate of corporate calculation. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that the mechanic in question has been relieved of duty. The station is under corporate governance, and we do not acknowledge—" The external display flickered. And then, with the methodical deliberation of a viper tightening around its prey, the Nexari dreadnought turned its forward batteries toward the station. Lieutenant Reeves swallowed hard. "They're charging weapons." Callum didn't need to be told. He could feel it. The change in atmosphere, the station's artificial gravity adjusting as shields powered up. The whisper of something heavier than fear coiling in the air like a storm waiting to break. Martez was white-knuckling the railing beside him. "This is about the kid, isn't it?" Callum nodded once. A moment passed. Then the station's defensive turrets flared to life, cycling into active response mode. "They're gonna fire," Martez whispered. Callum didn't answer. Because the moment those turrets so much as twitched, this station would be dust. Nothing survives the full firepower of a Nexari fleet. His eyes flickered back to the unconscious pilot. "I need to get to the hangar," he muttered. Martez looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" Callum was already moving. The lower docking bay was a chaotic mess of security personnel scrambling into position, weapons drawn and trained on the single Nexari dropship that had landed in the last 5 minutes. Its hull gleamed like a blade under pressure, reflective plating shifting under the station's dim emergency lighting. The boarding ramp extended. And then he saw him. High Admiral Xor Izarin descended with the heavy, measured gait of someone who never had to hurry for anyone. His armored plating bore the insignia of a warlord, etched into metal with the practiced elegance of tradition. 4 black eyes flickered over the gathered security team with clinical disinterest. He barely spared them a glance before speaking. "Where is the human named Callum Brannock?" Every weapon in the bay snapped toward Callum's direction. Slowly he stepped forward, shoulders squared, throat dry. "I'm Callum." Izarin's gaze settled on him fully. There was no visible expression, no reaction, just a long, unnerving silence, stretching into something heavier than mere observation. Then the Admiral spoke again, this time in a language Callum barely understood. The station translator struggled for a moment before the words filtered through. "You are the one who saved my son." Silence fell. Callum's pulse beat against his ribs, slow and methodical, the weight of what had just been said settling over him like a lead vest. The kid. The damn kid he pulled out of that wreck wasn't just some stranded scout. He was the heir to one of the most powerful war fleets in the sector. And now the Admiral stood in front of him, unreadable, waiting for an answer. Callum took a slow breath. "Yeah. I pulled him out before the ship caved in on itself." Izarin gave the smallest inclination of his head. Then, without looking away, he raised one hand and gestured toward the dreadnought in orbit. "Then you must come with me." Behind him, the external display of the station flared with a new alert. A second fleet had just arrived, and they weren't Nexari. A ripple passed through the station's hull, subtle, subsonic, like the breath of something ancient stirring in the deep. The Nexari fleet had arrived in force, but Callum's eyes weren't on them anymore. The new fleet emerging from sublight cast an entirely different shadow over the sector. Where the Nexari ships were lined with ceremonial etchings and sharp war banners, These were something else entirely. Dark-bodied, silent, predatory. Their formation was almost unnatural, shifting with an eerie fluidity that defied standard naval maneuvering. Ships moved like living things, gliding without inertia, shifting against the stars in ways that shouldn't be possible. Callum felt the weight of it before the alarms even blared. Martez, standing beside him at the docking bay's perimeter, let out a slow curse. That's not a diplomatic formation. No, it wasn't. Izarin, standing at the forefront, exhaled a low, modulated breath. Not fear, calculation. Then, without taking his eyes off the display, he spoke. They followed him. Callum didn't need to ask who he meant. His gaze flickered toward the med station stretcher now surrounded by Nexari guards, Yazir Own still unconscious beneath the bioscanner. They weren't here for a fight. They were here for the kid. And something about that made Callum's stomach knot tighter than any battle strategy he'd ever seen. The station's external defense grid buzzed to life, targeting solutions locking in. Supervisor Uxor's voice rattled over the intercom, barely masking the panic in his tone. All personnel to battle stations. We are escalating to high-threat engagement. Callum turned sharply. You fire on them, and we're all dead. Uxor's disbelief was palpable, even through the speakers. They have no jurisdiction here. A pulse hit the station before he could finish. Not a blast, not an impact, something else. It rolled through the infrastructure, shutting down external feeds, cutting static across the heads-up displays. The station's power flickered, stuttering like a heartbeat skipping a beat before struggling to stabilize. Callum's back hit the wall as the artificial gravity flickered, only for a second. A brief lapse. A warning. They're jamming us, Reeves called from the comm station. Long-range sensors are offline. Martez swore. That's no standard EMP. It's not. Izarin's voice was cool and unshaken, but there was an edge to it now, a weight that hadn't been there before. It's an apex disruptor field, and if they've activated it, then the war already started before you knew you were in it. Callum had seen many things in his time on the fringes of human space. Warlords, mercenary fleets, corporate blockades, but apex ships weren't ships in the traditional sense. They moved like void serpents, folding into spaces that shouldn't exist, shifting trajectories in ways that ignored every law of motion. Their hulls absorbed light rather than reflecting it, devouring signals, making them nearly impossible to track. They were ghosts of war, and they had just surrounded Dredger Station 12. Callum didn't realize he'd been clenching his fists until his nails dug into his palms. What do they want? Izarin tilted his head slightly. The same thing we do. Callum followed his gaze toward the med station, where Yazir Own lay, still unconscious, but shifting slightly now, as if something beyond the physical was pulling him toward wakefulness. It didn't make sense. Why would two of the most powerful war factions in the sector be after a kid, even an heir? Before he could ask, the comm system screeched, static shredded and distorted, before a voice pushed through. Human station, you are in possession of stolen prey. Release it and we will not harvest your bones. The words didn't match the vocal structure of anything Callum had heard before. The Apex didn't speak in normal languages. They spoke in intent. The words didn't translate. They crawled into the mind like whispers spoken through shattered glass. The guards flanking Izarin tensed, their weapons inching higher. The High Admiral himself remained still, only his lower mandibles shifting slightly in what Callum guessed was the Nexari equivalent of a sneer. You've lost your claim, Izarin answered coolly. The air belongs to us now. Silence. Then the Apex spoke again. You do not own what the deep has already marked. The station's lights flickered again, and then something on the hull moved. At first it was just a shadow, a smudge against the void. Then it unfolded, stretching, slithering, breaking apart and reforming in jagged, crawling motions. Martez sucked in a breath. What the hell? The first Apex boarding spire slammed into the docking bay. Everything happened at once. The station's structural alarms screamed warnings across every system, but it was already too late. The apex had boarded. The docking bay's outer plating buckled as the spire's segmented limbs dug into the metal, piercing through like fangs sinking into flesh. Its surface shifted, black bone plating writhing as something inside began peeling through. The first apex war form emerged, and Callum's gut turned to ice. It wasn't wearing armor. It was armor. Exoskeletal plating shaped like curved obsidian knives, elongated limbs clicking against the metal as it unfolded into full stance. Its body was too thin, too stretched, and yet the way it moved had the deliberate grace of something that had never known failure. And then it turned its head. No eyes. Just a carved hollow where its face should have been. It moved first. The guards barely had time to react. The first two were cut down before they even fired, slashed open by razor-thin arms that sliced through combat armor like paper. The third managed a shot, but the apex twisted, bending in unnatural ways, dodging without effort. Callum didn't hesitate. He grabbed Martez and yanked him behind cover. "Get to the power controls. We need to cut them off." Before he could finish, a second war form leapt from the spire, landing between them. Martez went for his sidearm. It knocked the weapon away before he even pulled the trigger. Callum reached for the closest thing, a loose plasma cutter from the repair rack, and swung. The tool clashed against the apex's outer plating, the impact sending a shock through his arm. No damage. It cocked its head at him, then moved. Callum barely ducked in time. A blade-like limb sliced through the air where his throat had been seconds ago. They were too fast, too deliberate, and there were more coming. Izarin's voice cut through the chaos. "Fall back! Regroup at the intersector!" Callum's back hit the bulkhead, his breathing ragged, his mind raced for a way out. Then, over the station-wide comms, another voice. This one familiar. Ysir Own, awake, speaking. "They're not here for me. They're here for what's underneath." Callum froze. Underneath? Before he could process it, another apex warform dropped onto the deck. Its eyeless void locked onto him. It tilted its head. Then, for the first time, it spoke without translation assistance. "You woke it." And then everything collapsed. The apex warform lunged. Callum barely rolled in time, its blade-thin limbs slicing through the bulkhead behind him like paper. Metal screeched, the gash glowing red-hot from the impact. He hit the floor hard, fingers scrambling against the slick deck plating for anything that could be used as a weapon. "Move!" Izarin's bark cut through the chaos. Callum kicked himself backward just as a burst of plasma fire slammed into the apex's side, the shot searing through its armor. It staggered, something like liquid metal oozing from the wound, but instead of falling, it recalibrated, its form shifting, absorbing the damage, adapting. Izarin fired again. The second shot had no effect. Callum's breath came sharp as he pushed himself upright. "That's a problem." Izarin didn't answer. He didn't need to. His stance was already shifting, mandibles tightening in that predatory way Nexari had when something turned from a fight into a hunt. Another apex warform dropped from the spire. Then another. And another. The docking bay was flooding, their obsidian frames blending into the dim emergency lighting, slithering through the wreckage like shadows given form. "Fall back!" Izarin barked, voice sharp and unyielding. Callum grabbed Martez by the collar, yanking him toward the inner corridor. "Go! Now!" They ran. The station's emergency bulkhead slammed shut behind them, sealing the docking bay. Callum braced his hands against his knees, catching his breath as the tremors from the apex boarding spire still vibrated through the walls, an ominous drumbeat of something deeper waking beneath their feet. Martez coughed, rubbing at his ribs. That was close. Callum shot him a look. "They let us go." Martez blinked. "What?" "They had us surrounded," Callum said, voice tight. "If they wanted to cut us down, they would have." A heavy silence settled over the group. Izarin was watching Callum now, dark gaze unreadable. "You're not wrong." Callum straightened. "Then why?" Izarin exhaled sharply, his mandibles twitching. "Because killing us wasn't their priority." He turned his gaze toward the nearest laser plasma display, tapping into the station's structural integrity feed. The schematic flickered, data corrupt, distorted from the disruptor pulse. But there was something there, something moving below the docking bay. Martez swallowed. "We should be alone down there." Callum's stomach turned. Yazir Own was still standing at the medical console, his luminescent markings pulsing like a dying heartbeat. His voice was quieter this time, but the weight of it still settled deep in Callum's bones. "They're not here for me," the Nixari air murmured. "They're here for what's underneath." The station trembled. Callum had spent the last 6 years repairing the station. He knew its framework, its patched-up hull, its aging circuits. But as he stared at the heads-up display, tracking the irregular seismic shifts pulsing through the lower sectors, he realized something. There was a part of the station he didn't recognize. Not a storage bay, not an abandoned maintenance shaft. Something deeper, older, buried beneath steel and reinforced alloy, and it was waking up. Callum exhaled, running a hand down his face. "You want to explain why my station is sitting on something it shouldn't be?" Izarin's gaze didn't waver. "I was about to ask your kind the same question." Callum clenched his jaw. "If we don't figure out what's happening down there, we won't have a station left to argue over." Izarin gave a slow nod. "Then we move." The lower levels weren't built for heavy foot traffic. Dust clung to the air, thick and stagnant, undisturbed for years. The metal walls had the aged look of something that had been forgotten, left to corrode in the darkness. Callum's boots clanked softly as he moved forward, rifle drawn. Not that he expected a bullet to do much, but it was better than standing there with nothing. Martez clicked on his wrist light. The beam cut through the murk, casting elongated shadows against the walls. Something shifted in the dark. Callum stiffened, raising his weapon. "What was that?" Silence. Then Izarin moved forward, mandibles twitching as he crouched near the far wall. His claws scraped against the metal, then sank through it like it wasn't there. Callum's stomach twisted. It wasn't a wall. It was a door, a forgotten one that had been sealed from the inside. Izarin's voice was low when he spoke. "Open it." Callum hesitated. Then, with a slow breath, he keyed into the old access panel. It resisted at first, its system flickering. Then with a sharp mechanical snarl, the hidden door slid open. The air inside was thick, stagnant, wrong. The room beyond was massive, not part of the original station framework, something built before. And in the center of it, Callum's pulse stilled. A structure, not quite a machine, not quite stone, pulsing with a deep, ember-like glow, shifting as if aware, breathing. Martez took an unsteady step forward. "What the hell is that?" Yazir Own exhaled. "It's a tomb." Before Callum could process that, the entire station lurched. Not an explosion, not a hull breach, something deeper. The glow in the chamber flared, its patterns shifting, twisting, forming something almost like a language, something trying to be understood. Then the apex spoke again, not through comms, not through any transmission, through the walls themselves. "It belongs to the deep. You were fools to wake it." The ground cracked. The station fractured beneath their feet. Metal groaned, twisting under forces it was never built to withstand. The deep-set glow within the buried structure surged, its embered core pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Callum barely caught himself against the fractured railing as gravity shifted violently. His mind raced. This wasn't just a tremor. It was something waking. A hollow, dissonant resonance crawled through the station's infrastructure, vibrating in his skull. The apex had called it a tomb, but Callum understood something deeper now. This wasn't just a place of burial. It was something imprisoned. "Move!" Izarin's command cut through the upheaval. The Nixari warlord pulled himself upright, mandibles tight with something Callum couldn't place. Not fear, but a measured urgency. Martez shoved off the ground, eyes wild. "Where?" "The whole damn station is falling apart." Callum's gaze snapped to the heads-up display on his wrist. His neural interface flickered between corrupted readings and seismic failures across the station's subsystems. He wasn't the only one noticing it. Yazir Own, barely stable, breath labored, staggered toward the open chamber. His luminescent patterns pulsed erratically. like the structure was trying to communicate with him. Callum caught his arm before he collapsed. Hey, hey, stay with me. What's happening? The Nexari heir's fingers dug into his wrist, trembling. It's not just waking up. He exhaled sharply, voice fractured. It's listening. The station lurched again, but this time it wasn't a collapse. It was a pull, a slow, invisible drag, like something deep within the buried construct was reaching beyond its prison. The air thickened, static crackling at the edge of perception. Izarin's mandibles curled inward, his stance shifting. He knew something, had known all along. Callum stepped forward, blood pounding. What the hell is this? The Nexari admiral's response was measured. The last war never truly ended. Callum felt the weight of it before the words even settled. The cold realization that this wasn't some forgotten relic. This was something designed for war. Something so destructive that even the Apex, for all their terror, had feared it. A vibration thrummed through the walls, crawling up Callum's spine. Then the Apex voice returned, not over comms, not through speakers, through the station itself. You buried the deep, but you did not kill it. Callum's breath stalled. The Apex weren't fighting for power. They weren't here for territory. They were trying to stop it. A rupture split the floor in front of them, molten energy searing through the cracks. The buried construct was activating. And whatever it was no longer content with being forgotten. The station's emergency lockdown systems flickered uselessly as data feeds collapsed. Every automated defense, every override Callum tried to engage, it was all being rewritten by something deeper, something not part of human or Nexari design. Izarin moved with military precision, barking commands to his remaining forces through his wrist link. Seal off every access point to the lower decks. No one engages unless I give the order. A Nexari lieutenant's response crackled through the line, static warped. We've lost full control of outer defenses. The Apex fleet is repositioning. Callum clenched his jaw. They're not retreating. No. Izarin's gaze darkened. They're preparing for containment. Martez swore under his breath. Containment? That's what this is? He gestured toward the fissures spreading through the station's superstructure, the energy bleeding from beneath them. Looks like a damn execution to me. Callum's mind raced. If the Apex had been tracking this place, waiting for any sign of activation, then this wasn't an attack. It was a purge, and they were still inside the kill zone. Ysir Own braced against the wall, his pulse erratic. His gaze was distant, as if his mind was being pulled between two realities. His fingers curled into a fist. It's trying to break the seal. Callum barely had time to react before the walls fractured outward, splitting into jagged veins of pure heat. A sound, not from within the station, but from within the buried structure itself. A single low vibration that shook the bones in his body, a war cry from something that should have never been heard again. Then the Apex attacked. The first wave breached through the external corridors, moving faster than any biological entity should. The war forms weren't here to fight. They were here to destroy. They didn't target Callum or the Nexari forces. They targeted the construct. Plasma cutters seared into the buried framework, carving into the living metal, trying to collapse the structure before it reached full activation. Izarin moved, his soldiers responding instantly, weapons trained. But Callum grabbed his arm before he could give the order to fire. "They're not fighting us," Callum barked. "They're trying to stop whatever the hell is waking up down there." Izarin's mandibles tightened, but he didn't push him off. His dark gaze flickered between the Apex strike teams and the fissures spreading like a wound refusing to close. Then Ysir Own staggered forward. Callum caught him before he collapsed again, his entire frame racked with some unseen force. His voice was barely above a whisper. "If they fail, we all die." The words settled like lead against Callum's ribs. Izarin finally exhaled. Then, without a word, he turned to his command unit. "Fall back." His soldiers didn't argue. The Nexari forces pulled out without a single shot fired. The Apex, for the first time, didn't engage. They simply continued cutting into the construct, working with an urgency that Callum could feel, even without understanding their language. The structure shuddered. The fissures widened. Callum took a slow breath. He knew what was coming. They had minutes, maybe less, before this whole place either collapsed or became something far worse. Yazir Own's fingers curled into Callum's sleeve, his gaze locking onto his with a sudden terrifying clarity. "We have to decide," Callum swallowed. "Decide what?" The Nexari heir didn't blink. "If we're leaving this place behind, or taking control of it." A chill crawled up Callum's spine. Then the station's primary alarm tripped, and a new energy signature registered on the Apex fleet's scanners. Callum turned toward the main display. His breath stalled. The construct wasn't just activating, it was sending a signal, not to the Nexari, not to the Apex, to something older, something that had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. Callum's pulse pounded against his skull. Izarin stared at the screen, unblinking. Then he whispered something in Nexari, voice lower than a prayer, heavier than a curse. Callum didn't need a translation, because whatever was coming was already here. The station trembled as the buried construct pulsed again, a rhythmic surge of energy unlike anything Callum had ever felt. Not a simple power-up sequence, not a system booting to life. It was calling. And something out there was listening. Callum's eyes locked onto the laser plasma display, the readout flickering wildly with interference. The Apex fleet had repositioned, but their formation wasn't offensive. It was defensive. They weren't bracing for an attack, they were bracing for something bigger. Izarin exhaled sharply, his mandibles twitching. They knew. Callum glanced at him. "What?" The Nexari admiral didn't turn from the display. "The Apex. They've always known. They've been waiting for this exact moment." His claws flexed against the control panel. "And we've just given them a reason to act." Before Callum could respond, the station-wide alarm ruptured the silence. Gravitational distortions detected. Incoming contact. The words felt heavier than they should have. Martez stiffened. That doesn't sound like an ordinary fleet arrival. Because it wasn't. The display glitched again, struggling to make sense of what it was reading. But Callum didn't need a clean readout to understand what was happening. Whatever the construct had summoned was no ship. The station trembled. Not from an impact. Not from weapons fire. From mass displacement. Something had arrived. But it hadn't come from normal space. It had forced itself through. A shadow swallowed the Apex fleet. Then the first ship ruptured. Not from an explosion, not from weapon fire. The hull simply split open, collapsing inward like a crushed lung, metal curling and folding in ways that defied physics. Then the next ship, and the next. The Apex fleet wasn't losing. It was being erased. Callum's pulse pounded as he watched the impossible unfold. And then, through the deafening chaos, Yazir Own's voice cut through. "They're not attacking." Callum turned sharply. The Nexari heir's breathing was unsteady, his glowing markings flickering like a dying pulse. But his eyes were sharp, locked onto the display with a terrifying clarity. "They're not fighting it," he whispered. "They're feeding it." A deep, guttural vibration crawled through the walls, settling in Callum's chest like a weight too heavy to breathe through. Not a sound, a presence. The Apex weren't losing the battle. They were sacrificing themselves to stop something worse. And they were failing. Izarin snapped out orders in Nexari, his soldiers scrambling into formation. "Prepare all strike teams. Every available ship. Launch now." Callum's head whipped toward him. "You just said their fleet isn't winning. We don't need to win." Izarin's tone was cold, clipped, lethal. "We need to sever the signal before it stabilizes." Callum's gut tightened. "You want to destroy the construct?" Izarin turned fully, facing him now. "This is no construct, Brannick." His gaze darkened. "This is a conduit." Callum swallowed. "A conduit to what?" Izarin's mandibles tightened, his voice almost grim. "To something that should have never been named." The station shook again, but this time it wasn't an external force. It was coming from within. The buried structure began shifting, its patterns altering, adapting, responding. The Apex had failed to collapse it. Now, whatever had been imprisoned here was breaking free on its own. Callum moved without thinking, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. The power grid. If they still had access, they might still have a chance. He reached the nearest console, fingers flying over the controls. "Tell me we can still manually override station-wide systems," Martez cursed. "You're asking for a miracle." Callum didn't look up. "Then let's pull one out of our damn pockets." Izarine's forces moved with calculated efficiency, arming explosive charges along the remaining structural weak points. Callum's wrist display flickered, the station's schematics overlaying across his field of vision. There was one weak point left. The energy surge from the construct had rerouted power flow across the station. One last corridor, one last conduit leading straight into the core, a final failsafe, designed to shut the system down if all else failed. But it had never been activated before, because it had never been meant to be. Callum inhaled sharply. "There's a lockdown point in Sector 12K. If we reroute the charge, we can force a shutdown." Izarine nodded once. "Then do it." The descent toward the sector was brutal. The station wasn't stable anymore. The deeper they moved, the more the air itself changed. Static charged the atmosphere, making Callum's skin prickle like something unseen was dragging its claws across his back. Yazir-On stumbled, but Callum caught him before he collapsed. The Nexari air's markings had dimmed almost entirely now. Callum steadied him. "Stay with me, kid." Yazir-On's fingers clenched his sleeve. His gaze flickered toward the walls, voice barely above a whisper. "We're running out of time." The final control panel was half buried under shifting metal, the station's frame warping from the energy distortion. Callum dropped to his knees, ripping apart the outer casing. Martez knelt beside him. "Tell me you know what you're doing." "I don't." Callum yanked out the primary linkage cables. "But I've got a damn good guess." The power system fought him. Not just from the damage, but something else. It was like the station itself was resisting. Izaren fired a shot into the nearest panel, overloading the system. Sparks rained down, and for the first time, the station responded. A deep mechanical grind echoed through the corridors. The conduit was shutting down, for now. The station-wide power flickered. The buried construct's glow dimmed. Callum exhaled, pressing his forehead against the control panel. They'd stopped it, but not destroyed it. Izarin's comlink flared. His lieutenant's voice cut through the static. "Admiral, the Apex fleet. They're leaving." Izarin's gaze flickered toward the display. The Apex forces were withdrawing, slipping back into the darkness they had come from. Not retreating, repositioning. Callum watched them go, his gut twisted. "They'll be back." Izarin's voice was quiet but firm. "Yes." Callum glanced toward Yazir-On, who hadn't spoken since the shutdown. The Nexari heir's fingers curled into a fist. His breath was unsteady, but his voice was clear. They weren't the real threat. Callum's skin prickled. Before he could speak, the station sensors registered something else, something watching them, something still waiting. And for the first time in his life, Callum Brannock understood something terrifying. They hadn't stopped the war. They'd just lit the fuse. The station's core throbbed like a failing heartbeat, its structure groaning beneath the weight of something unseen. The Apex fleet had withdrawn into the shadows, but the real war had only begun. Callum Brannock stared at the laser plasma display, watching the residual energy signatures flicker in and out of detection. The buried construct wasn't just an ancient relic. It had functioned as a beacon, a door, a waiting threshold. And something had answered. Izarin stood rigid beside him, his 4 black eyes narrowed, mandibles barely shifting as he processed the same feed. Nexari war doctrine was built on overwhelming force, but brute strength wouldn't be enough here. Not against this. Martez exhaled sharply, rubbing at the sweat on his forehead. "Tell me I'm wrong, but that doesn't look like a retreat." Callum's gaze didn't leave the display. No formation, no recognizable flight patterns. The Apex weren't falling back to regroup. They had taken a defensive stance around the construct, boxing it in, sealing it within a containment they hadn't been fast enough to activate before. He tapped the side of the screen, enhancing the signal overlay. The distortions hadn't stopped. They were slowing, recalibrating, adjusting to something larger. Yazir-On's voice was quieter than before, but steadier. "They're holding position, waiting." Callum glanced at him. Waiting for what? The Nexari air's glowing markings had dimmed, but his focus had sharpened. He was looking past the readouts, past the station's failing infrastructure, as if he could see beyond the material, into the raw mechanics of what was unfolding. They're preparing for the second wave. The strategic room was makeshift at best. The main heads-up display flickered erratically, barely holding together after the station-wide disruption. Wires had been ripped from overloaded circuits, consoles repurposed for direct data streaming from what was left of the power grid. Callum leaned over the schematic, running a mental tally of every resource they still had left. It wasn't much. The external defense grid was crippled, unable to target anything beyond mid-range. The Nexari fleet was in better shape, but they were outnumbered, and more importantly, outpositioned. The Apex weren't launching a direct assault, and that was a problem, because the best way to defeat overwhelming force was to make them waste their firepower on something that wasn't the real target. "They're not here to fight a battle," Callum muttered, tracing his fingers along the projected containment field's last known coordinates. "They're here to slow us down." Yaziran shifted, eyes darkening. "Explain." Callum straightened. "Think about it. They know what's coming. They've spent years waiting for this moment, ready to react the second this thing woke up. If they wanted to finish us off, they would have done it before we got control back." He tapped the display. "They don't want to kill us. They want us to focus on them." Martez frowned. "So we don't see the real threat until it's too late." Callum nodded. "Exactly." The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of the realization settled over them. If they played into the Apex's hands, they would waste every resource trying to push back a force that wasn't even their real enemy. They needed a new strategy. Yaziran's claws flexed against the edge of the console. "We can't afford to split our forces. If we thin our defenses to cover all angles, we leave critical points exposed." Callum exhaled through his nose. "Then we don't split. We concentrate." Martez shot him a look. "That sounds like suicide." "Not if we choose the right battlefield." Callum turned toward the outer defense readouts, tracking the remaining shield coverage along the station's underbelly, the weakest sector, where they wanted their enemy to hit. Yazir-On's gaze flickered toward him. "A trap," Callum nodded. "We reinforce one location, force them into thinking they have the advantage, then close the door behind them. Apex doctrine is built on fluidity. They rely on adaptability, not direct confrontation. If we control where they move, we limit how fast they can react." Yaziran studied the data, his mind working through the logistics. Nexari battle doctrine prioritized strength through formation, predictability. But Callum's plan wasn't about winning with numbers. It was about control. Yaziran's mandibles twitched slightly. "You want to lure them into a bottleneck." Callum gave a sharp nod. "And then we make sure they never get out." Implementation. The lower docking sectors were converted into reinforced kill zones. Ion disruptors, normally reserved for emergency EMP lockdowns, were reprogrammed for localized detonation. The Nexari warships adjusted their formation, shifting into a staggered defense grid, a false vulnerability designed to bait the Apex strike teams. Every step had to look like a mistake. Overloaded shielding in Sector 14, a weakness that could be exploited. A false gap in the station's flank, a lure disguised as a breach. They didn't need to destroy the Apex fleet. They needed to make them believe they had already won. And when the trap snapped shut, when the Apex forces committed fully to the engagement, that was when Callum would give the real order. The waiting was the worst part. The distant tremors of movement outside the station, the shifting gravity as ships maneuvered. Every second stretched thin, drawn tight. Then it happened. The Apex took the bait. The first wave of their ships shifted trajectory, banking toward the compromised sector. Their formations remained loose, flexible, ready to adapt at a moment's notice. Exactly what Callum wanted. He braced himself, his fingers tightening over the command console. Then, in a single breath, he spoke. Now! The trap detonated. The disruptors activated in synchronized pulses, sending electromagnetic shockwaves through the apex formations. Their ships, built for adaptive warfare, suddenly lost control of their fluid motion. They had nowhere to move. Izaran's forces struck the second the apex ships faltered. Nexari warships carved through their ranks, cutting their fleet into segmented, vulnerable clusters. Callum redirected emergency power to the shield emitters, reversing the polarity, creating an implosive force instead of a protective barrier. The apex ships tried to disengage. Too late. The defensive field collapsed inward, pulling their ships into the bottleneck, into the kill zone they had unknowingly flown straight into. Callum didn't celebrate. Not yet. His gaze snapped back to the external scanners. Something was still wrong. Then the station shook, violently, more than before, not from combat, from something beneath them. Ysir-On's voice was barely audible, but the weight of his words made Callum's stomach drop. They're not trying to win. Callum turned, his chest tightening. What? Ysir-On's glowing markings flared sharply. His voice was clearer now, more certain. They knew this was coming. He inhaled, steadying himself. They planned for it. And for the first time, Callum realized the truth. The Apex weren't here to stop the construct from waking. They were here to contain the real threat, because something had already escaped, and it was still waiting. The station shuddered as the buried construct convulsed, energy spiraling through its framework like veins pulsing with molten iron. Callum braced against the control panel, eyes locked on the laser plasma display, tracking what should have been a victory. It wasn't. The Apex fleet was in disarray, trapped in the kill zone they'd stumbled into. Nexari warships tore through their ranks, cutting them apart like a blade through silk. But none of it mattered, because something else had already left the construct. Callum's gaze snapped to Ysir-On. The Nexari air's glowing markings had stabilized now, but his expression was unreadable. Not fear, not anger, something deeper. They were never here to stop the activation, Ysir-On murmured. They were here to slow it down. The station's external sensors collapsed into static, then flickered back online, registering an unknown contact. Not a ship, not a fleet, a mass, a presence. Something too large, too old, too deliberate. It moved between the stars, as if the space itself folded in deference, shaping to its will. It hadn't arrived through normal means. It had emerged from somewhere outside of time, outside of known physics. And now it was here. Callum's breath hitched, his pulse an erratic drumbeat. What is that? Izarin exhaled slowly, watching the data feed with something Callum had never seen before in the warlord's stance. Not calculation, not command, recognition. The thing we buried, Izarin said quietly, and the thing that never forgot. A vibration rippled through the station. Not an attack, not a force, a presence settling into the sector. Callum felt it, not in his body, but in his thoughts. An intruder at the edges of perception, something that was never supposed to be spoken into existence. Then, for the first time, the Apex broke formation. They weren't trying to contain it anymore. They were fleeing. We need to get out of here. Martez's voice was tight, his hands gripping the console. Right now. Callum barely heard him. His mind was working at a speed he couldn't articulate. Fleeing wouldn't matter. Running wouldn't matter. Whatever had woken beneath the station was here now, stretching beyond the material, and the only reason they were still standing was because it hadn't yet decided to move. Ysir-On exhaled sharply. It's thinking. Callum turned sharply. Thinking? The Nexari air's gaze flickered toward the display, then back toward the exposed framework of the buried structure. It was no longer pulsing with residual energy. It was waiting. It remembers, Ysir-On whispered. Callum's hands tightened into fists. He didn't like the sound of that. Remembers what? The Nexari air looked at him then, and his voice came softer, heavier. What it was built for. The weight of that sentence settled over the war room like iron plating against bone. Because Callum understood, in the way a mechanic understood a system, in the way an engineer could see the shape of a thing before it functioned. This wasn't just a weapon. This wasn't just an ancient war relic. This was something built for a singular purpose. Not destruction, not conquest, but survival. It had waited, buried beneath the station, dormant beneath the hands of species that came long after it was sealed, waiting for the moment it would be needed again. And now it had been called. Not by the Apex, not by the Nexari, by him. Callum's pulse pounded against his ribs. Because if that was true, then the only thing left to decide was whether to let it finish what it had started. Izarin's voice pulled him from the spiral. Whatever choice we make, we don't get to undo it. Callum dragged a hand down his face, steadying himself. I know, but they had to make it now, because whatever this thing had once been, whatever purpose it had been designed for, it was looking for a mind to finish the command. Callum's gut twisted. The Apex had feared it enough to throw everything into delaying its return. The Nexari had buried it so deeply it had nearly been forgotten. But Callum had woken it, and now it was listening. Ysir Own stepped forward. It doesn't understand us the way we do. It wasn't made for language, not as we know it. His fingers twitched slightly, his breath shallower. It was made for war. Callum's throat tightened. Then we give it one. Izarin turned sharply. You want to activate it? Callum exhaled. I want to finish what the Apex failed to. Silence. Martez let out a low, uneven breath. You're serious. Callum didn't blink. Deadly. The Apex had spent centuries trying to contain this thing, fought to stop it from waking, because they knew. They knew humans would be the ones reckless enough to turn it back on. Callum reached toward the console, fingers hovering over the final override sequence. He could feel it waiting. A weapon with no allegiance, no directives left, just the last will of the hands that had built it. He swallowed, and then he gave it a name. Wake up! The station's core roared to life. The buried framework shifted, reshaping, folding outward like steel unraveling from its locked form. Power flooded back through the conduits, igniting systems that had been cold for centuries. The thing stirred, but it didn't reach for the Nexari. It didn't reach for the Apex. It reached for him. The display flared, shifting into configurations Callum didn't recognize but understood instinctively. This was not a machine. This was a battlefield given form, a design, a purpose. Something had been waiting for an architect to give it form again. Callum's hand curled into a fist. Fine. If the Apex wanted to play gods with history, if the Nexari wanted to forget, then humanity would do what it had always done. Take what was broken and make it theirs. Callum's voice was calm when he spoke. Let's see what this thing can really do. The Apex were already running. Izarin watched them scatter into the abyss beyond the station, his stance unreadable. He had spent his life thinking in orders, in fleets, in structured war. But this wasn't structured. This was a shift. Callum flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the command system settling against his mind, the construct responding, not in servitude, not in programming, in understanding. For the first time, a Nexari admiral turned toward a human and saw what his species had always ignored. Callum wasn't just fixing things anymore. He was rewriting them. Izarin's mandibles twitched. What are you, Brannock? Callum exhaled, watching as the construct finally came alive beneath his hands. He smiled. The last mechanic you'll ever fire.